Hello, everyone, and welcome to Why Elderly Has Meaning and Power. My name is Dr. Aubrey Shaw, and my co-author is Dr. Sharon K. Stoll. The purpose of this presentation is twofold. First, we will be discussing the relationship between words and the body. And secondly, we will consider the effect of words demeaning the body of the elderly. First, we need to discuss what is the elderly and why it is important. Lois Keith, a writer and a wheelchair user, said that even though she cannot stand on her own 2 feet, her condition does not make her weak. Rather, she is elderly, different than other people. In addition, she makes an important point by asking 2 questions. Whose body is it, and who decides the worth of that body? Why this is important is because the person who is para-abled should be deciding the worth of their body and see themselves as capable. However, today, usually that decision is up to people who are able-bodied. As Lois Keith continues to say, even though she must often depend on other human beings, she is still capable. And that is important because she is making the decision for herself and her body. Furthermore, Michael Oliver, a writer and a researcher in the field of disability studies, agrees with Lois and what she has to say. Michael Oliver agrees because of his background. He is a quadriplegic. He was the first professor in the Center for Disabilities at Leeds University, and he named the Great Britain social model of disability, which he might not totally agree with, but he named it. His work is important to the elderly conversation because he argues that there are 2 types of researchers in the field, able-bodied and para-abled. Moreover, he explains how the lived experience of the person matters in research. In that, able-bodied researchers have a different perspective on disability than para-able-bodied researchers. What body one is in matters for the perspective of the elderly. And he argues that people with physical disabilities, the para-abled, should be the only ones in disability studies or disability sport researching. Furthermore, Michael Oliver wrote a paper on walking and what is so wonderful about walking. And in this article, he makes an argument about how walking is a societal symbol of the able-bodied. And able-bodiedness should not be linked to walking. However, his point is lost since society does judge a person's physical ability by their walking or lack thereof. Which leads us to the able-bodied individuals and what they do to demean the power of the elderly. So able-bodied individuals often demean the power and ability of the individual who are elderly. This includes people who are para-abled. And the able-bodied individuals demean the power by having these 2 assumptions. One assumption is the assumption of inability. That person can't do that because of that impairment. And there is an assumption that person does not have any influence and cannot have any influence, which is not true. Furthermore, they demean the ability by having these 3 assumptions. The assumption of pain, that people with physical disabilities are always in pain. Some of them might be, but most of them are not. There is an assumption that a cognitive disability comes with a physical disability, which is not true. And there is an assumption that that person is weak, which also goes to the assumption of inability. Now, why is this important? because people who are otherly have always been treated poorly. History is clear. Okay? Going back in the history, we can see that people who are otherly were treated poorly. The Greeks, and they believed that people with physical disabilities were cursed and did not deserve to live. So what they did was they left them out on the streets to die. The Romans, they had the same beliefs as the Greeks. However, if the family had money, then that child would be hidden away. And in most every society, a generation to generation, the same occurs in some fashion. Today, we still hide our children away with physical disabilities, not as much as the Romans did, but it does occur. So in our societies, we have laws, and Oliver argued that laws have failed this population, even though we have many laws. And the laws are meant to push for inclusion of people with physical disabilities in society. In the United States alone, we have 3 major laws. We have the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. We have the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, and we have the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of 2004. Those 3 laws were meant to push for inclusion. Internationally, countries have their own laws for the specific population, and there is an international law from the United Nations that includes people with physical disabilities. However, 49 years later, like Oliver said, laws have failed. Students with physical disabilities are still being excluded from physical education, recreation, and sport. And why? There are many reasons that the literature talks about, but one major reason is that physical education teachers and coaches are not prepared to teach students with physical disabilities. And within the United States, you can see this. In the state that I live in, students only have to take 1 class of physical education, recreation, and inclusion for students with disabilities. And you can tell that these students are not being properly prepared. Now we're going to consider the effect of words that demean the body of the otherly. So we have language and Amy Mullins. From time immemorial, language describes these individuals as crippled or worse. Amy Mullins is a United States Paralympian, and she did a 2009 TED Talk. And she discusses in that TED Talk how words have meaning. And today we don't have enough time to watch the TED Talk, but the TED Talk is right here, in which I highly suggest everyone go watch that TED Talk of Amy Mullins. And within this TED Talk, she discusses how the words we choose describe what we value and believe. And often we use words to describe others, and those words are sadly inadequate and often belittling and defaming. In addition, we need to consider the word disabled. Synonyms for this word are handicapped, wrecked, ruined, lamed, and crippled. And this is a very common word that we use. So what is the relationship between words and the body? So we have language, and how much thought was actually given to the words and the meaningfulness of language, including the word disability. Now, Amy Mullins' point is very well taken in this case, because the words that we choose describe what we value and believe. And what we value and believe turn into our attitudes, and how our attitudes toward ourselves and to others. And so the attitudes of other bodies are also shown through our language. And what does disability really mean? If we break down disability, the Latin root of dis means not. So by using the word disability, we're actually saying not able. Well, think about that. Furthermore, words demeaning the body of the otherly. So we have this word disabled, which we have the synonyms of handicapped, wrecked, ruined, lame, and crippled. Then we know that it means not able. Then we have our antonyms of abled, energized, strengthened, fortitude, and cured. And when we look at the word disabled, what do we call a stalled car? Now, in the United States, we call a stalled car a disabled car. Usually, people are saying, oh, a disabled car is on the left-hand side or the right-hand side. And when we actually think about this, a disabled car, a disabled person. And so it takes me back to what Buber says. And Buber in 1970, he did work on the I, thou, and the I, it. And then he explains how we see people in two different ways. We either see them as ourselves, the I, thou, or we see a person as an object, an I, it. And by describing a person, a disabled person, okay, we're really seeing them as an I, it. We're seeing them as an object. And how would you like to be described? Okay, would you like to be described as an object or a person? Or a person that people assume that you must be cured. So I have a challenge for you, and my co-author has a challenge for you too. And the challenge is don't use the word disabled, and take that out of your language and your vocabulary, and use other words. Okay? We perceive the world through the body that we live in, and that's okay. Everybody has a different body. You might be able-bodied, you might be para-abled. Okay? The able-bodied define everything through their bodies, define disability through an able-body's perspective, see it in a different perspective, and see others as totally othered and not as themselves. So our challenge to you is really see that person as yourself and don't use the word disability. But furthermore, para-abled individuals, if you talk to them, we have 3 examples. We have Stella Young, Amy Mullins, and myself. And Stella Young, she talked about how she has lived in her body for a very long time and she's very fond of it. And that's okay. And Amy Mullins, she discusses how when she was a young kid, if they said, would you like, your leg back, she would say yes. But these days, she might not say that right away because she has lived in her body and she has gotten those experiences through her body. Furthermore, Aubrey, myself, I would say the same thing and echo what Amy Mullins and Stella Young said about how we might not want to be able-bodied because we have this perception, we have a different perspective on life and different activities. So thank you very much. And here are our references.